Alrighty, this little video here is going to be just an overview of different multivariate techniques that are available to us in order to be able to assess and test relationships between variables. Quick look then at an overview might include kind of what we're looking at when we're thinking about how many independent variables we have, how many dependent variables we have, and the type of data that we're dealing with in each one. So in this little chart here, we have an indication where if you're looking between groups or looking between correlations, when we're dealing with correlations, we're going to have to deal with metric data. Usually when we're looking at between group differences, we're looking at categorical data, and then maybe corresponding the categorical data with some metric data. So that will result in whether it's dependent variable or independent variable. So we have independence and we have dependence, and the types of relationships we're looking at between the two will yield and describe the different multivariate method that we might be able to use. So there are a lot of different methods here. But the key takeaway here is that the type of method that we use depends on the type of data that we're investigating and the type of relationship we think will exist between the two. So when we look at different relationships, we have several different categorizations. So the bivariate relationship, which is sometimes we just think about as maybe a correlation like in R, would be the relationship between two variables. So two variables and how those two variables go together. Sometimes we have multiple relationships happening simultaneously. So a relationship between a set of variables as the set of variables relates to a dependent variable. So like when we look at R squared and multiple correlations, then we think of things like that. Finally, we have something called the canonical R. So we had two variables that were related to each other as bivariate. Multiple variates share correlation with each other and then maybe to a dependent variable. When we look at canonical correlations or canonical relationships, what we're doing is we're looking at the relationship between sets of variables. So imagine you have regression in this multiple R sense. What if you had 3 or 4 regression formulas and you wanted to compare the relationship between those regressions together? That would be a canonical R relationship. So the relationship between sets of variables as opposed to the relationship between variables is really what's happening right there. Okay, so this can be a little bit of a challenge because the complexity, of course, grows. But when we're looking at multivariates, we're really, kind of this is our home right here when we look at canonical and multiple R scenarios. As we progress through our review of different multivariate methods and techniques, this chart is extremely helpful in that it provides an overview of the different types of techniques, which will be seen down here at the bottom, ranging from multiple regression types of techniques all the way over here to multidimensional scaling, non-metric types of techniques, and so on. The structure of this particular graph shows that we basically split the techniques between dependence models and independence models, and that would relate to how the variables function with each other. So if some variables rely on another set of variables, then those would be dependence models. However, if we're looking for interdependence or relationships between variables, they'd be interdependence methods. So we'll quickly review and just give a brief overview here of these different types of methods. Some of these we will cover throughout the course that we're dealing with here. Others will not necessarily cover, but are important. So the thing to look at here would be the number of variables that you are looking at. So like for instance, one dependent variable versus several dependent variables. So the number of variables that you have in and the type they are, and then whether they are metric or non-metric. So that would be the thing to look at to help identify the different types of methods that we will move forward with. So dependence methods then are variables or sets of variables where there's a dependent variable and then there's prediction that we want to make to explain that dependent variable. And again, there's a variety of these methods all outlined in the chart that help describe and see help us see what we're really trying to focus on method-wise. Interdependence models would then involve the simultaneous analysis or the relationships that we find within a variable set or within a group of variables. So like I mentioned, multidimensional scaling, cluster analysis, factor analysis, those are things that we'll look at closely. And correspondence analysis as well. So multidimensional scaling and correspondence analysis is sometimes is used in perceptual mapping, which is something helpful to do. But then also the factor analysis and cluster analysis is something handy as well. So what we look at then, again, as we're trying to select a specific method, is the type of relationship that we're examining, dependence or interdependence. In the dependence relationship, we want to be concerned about what the independent variables are and the dependent variables. So what the predictor variables would be the independent variables usually, and then the thing we want to predict would be the dependent variable. And again, interdependence relationships deal with how variables relate to each other. So that's kind of the selection there. So as we look at these, we'll go from left to right in the main chart here that we're looking at. Multiple regression, we often look at a single dependent variable, and then we have multiple independent variables, and the data should be metric or continuous. And that's something you're probably familiar with or comfortable with understanding or noting multiple regression. So we have a y that is maybe indicated by several x variables, and we want to understand the degree to which the x or the independent variables predict the y. Discriminant analysis is used when we have non-metric data. So we have categorical data, and that categorical data may help us predict a dependent variable. Okay, so we may have some prediction we want to make, but we think that different groups of data or different groups of subjects may relate to that predicted variable in different ways. So we have two groups that discriminate against each other, or that can be differentiated, for some reason based on the dependent variable that we're trying to analyze. So we may have split a group of respondents by male and female on gender, and we might think that gender is an important factor in explaining how a certain behavior comes to be. So we might think males behave differently than females. So that behavior would probably be the dependent variable, and then we think that the fact that male and female play a role, but that's that variable in and of itself is non-metric. So we use a set of discriminant analysis methods then to analyze that type of relationship. Here are other examples of these types of variables that we're looking at that we think are influential here. So maybe credit risk, maybe cultural issues, and things like that. Logistical regression is another type of non-metric data analysis. And so this is a case where the actual dependent variable here is metric, and so, or it's non-metric, excuse me. It's either a yes or a no, or a purchased or didn't purchase, or something along those lines. So this violates a typical regression assumption, and typically in regression analysis, all the variables need to be metric. However, sometimes you have an outcome that's binary. Like I said, like purchased or didn't purchase, and we want to predict whether somebody will purchase or won't purchase. Well, that purchase question is a binary, so it's non-metric, and so we have a series of independent variables, which could be metric or non-metric, that predict the likelihood of a yes or a no or a binary result. So logit models, logistical regressions. We also have something called probit models, which would predict the probability of this happening. So probit models and logit models are very similar to each other. They incorporate non-metric data, but they are dependent models. MANOVAs are, again, when we have a relationship between dependencies. So we have y's and x's here, like we would in regression. The difference, however, is we may have lots of these dependent variables instead of just one. So several metric dependent variables are predicted by a set of non-metric indicators. ANOVAs are also things that we do. ANOVA models analysis of variances. So they would incorporate non-metric data as well. So MANOVAs, though, would require several different dependent variables. And you kind of see here on this chart, several dependent variables. We have different types of options here. Canonical analyses are included as well, where we have several dependent variables predicted by several dependent or independent variables. Yet with canonical analysis, as opposed to MANOVAs, these can be metric or non-metric, either one. Conjoint analysis is another method that is popular when we look to do preference ratings. Actually, conjoint analysis is something used quite often when we look at creating new products. We will look at, in terms of products, we'll look at the attributes of the product, and then we'll look at different levels of product attributes. And what's interesting here is you get something called a part worth and a score, and you get a value of the importance of the attribute, but then you also get an importance of the level of attribute when you do a conjoint analysis. But it is a type of regression. It really is a type of regression in concept, I guess, and it helps produce, again, the different types of preferences that consumers would have. So conjoint analysis is something that's interesting to do. Factor analysis. So factor analysis is a big thing that we do when we test our measurements, but then we also want to do something called reducing data. When we do data reduction, what we do is we take a whole bunch of variables, and then what we try to do is determine some underlying statistical relationship between the variables. So this is like we have 20 or 30 variables that we think maybe predict satisfaction, and then what we do is we want to reduce those variables to one score that would measure satisfaction. But we will only want to take the variables that have the most meaning. So statistically, we need to identify those, and we use factor analysis to help us do that. SEMs and CFAs. So structural equation modeling is when we have multiple formulas or multiple models, and we want to test them all at the same time. So if you have a fairly complex model, it would not be unusual to try to test the model all at once with lots of different formulas, if you will, happening, and kind of look at the interrelationship between those. So this is fairly complex modeling that we do, but if we had, like over here, we have three different formulas or models going on here, and we want to test all three of them at the same time, then we do a structural equation modeling type of a thing. So that's kind of what we do there. The CFA that you see in this little box here is another factor analysis. It's another type of factor analysis, only we use it when we actually test a model. So in factor analysis here, we were talking about exploratory factor analysis, and that is where we let the data drive the outcome. In a CFA, we actually specify how we think, by theory, how we think a model should look, and then we test it using a confirmatory factor analysis, which is another type of structural equation, or it's another application of structural equation modeling. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of methods here. It's clear that you have a lot of tools in your toolbox if you use all of these. This is a great example here of a structural equation model that's fairly complex. We have some outcome variable here, adoption, but we have all of these things happening all at once. So we have different measures for compatibility, we have different measures for information, we have different measures for risk and complexity, and a whole bunch of different measures for relative advantage. So each one of these here, these arrows and indicating these ovals, each one of these is like a really complex regression. And so we're measuring those. So we have 4 regressions going on there, but then we have these other relationships that are measured in between here as well. So we've got 4 regression models, which then lead into the ovals, and then the ovals are interrelated with each other. That's a pretty complicated model right there. But that's what we test when we do a structural equation model. That's the type. That's what it would. This is what one might look like. Okay, so then moving on, cluster analysis. So this is another independence model like factor analysis. So factor analysis and cluster analysis are both independent, interdependent models. In factor analysis, we're looking to group together variables that go together, like from a survey or something like that. In cluster analysis, what we're doing is we're looking to group together respondents. So this is super important when we start to look at target markets and identifying groups of consumers that behave the same way. We'll use a cluster analysis to help us identify those folks. Okay, so as an illustration here, we have a set of 4 questions that relate to dining out or eating out at restaurants. And so we have a variety of consumers who maybe answer this survey, and we have one group of consumers that fall in this lower section, and we have another group that fall in this middle section, and then we have a third group that fall in this upper section. And what we want to do is statistically separate out the consumers so that we can have like all the consumers who would typically be here versus all of them who would be here versus all of them who would be in this last group. And we would code them like low, medium, high, or something like that. And then we would treat each of these 3 groups as separate target markets. So what we're looking at is a strong correlation between the answers of the respondents in each of the groups. But then when you separate the groups out, you'd see that they're clearly separate. Okay, so that's an approach. So clustering is something we do a lot of. So again, clustering we do a lot of for identifying target markets and group membership. Factor analysis we do a lot of when we want to test our measures and we want to find measures that go together quite a bit. Structural equation modeling and the CFA work we do when we want to test complex systems of equations. We do a lot of MANOVA and ANOVA type work when we want to split up our data by factors, maybe especially in this non-metric group here, and when we have lots of dependent variables. We want to use discriminant analysis and logit models when we have some non-metric dependent variable. And then, of course, we want to use multiple regression quite a bit just to test models, you know, when our data is normally distributed and when we have one dependent variable, then regression is used. Conjoint analysis, again, it's a type of, you can think of it as a type of regression, but it's often used when we want to break up maybe a product into its individual attributes, and you want to understand what each of the attributes value is to the overall product's worth. It's an application of conjoint analysis, something that we do. Multidimensional scaling, MDS, is usually used when we do we use perceptual maps. So mapping is something that we do here. We look to, again, group respondents and or competitors maybe by similarities or preferences. So this is, again, it's something that we use where we actually calculate a distance between our subjects or our objects of interest, and we by that distance we think about how closely they are related or how similar they are versus how distant or unrelated they are with each other. The final category here then is correspondence analysis. So correspondence analysis, kind of similar to this MDS here, would use non-metric data. So as opposed to metric data, use non-metric data to better understand the linear relationship it has to again the non-metric response that we're looking at. Again, with correspondence analysis, it's a perceptual map application that we use in marketing. Okay, so clearly there are a ton of different options here in terms of methods that we can use. Again, we want to think about whether we're trying to predict something or we're trying to maybe group or reorganize the structure of our data. So that would relate to the dependence versus the independence notion. We also want to better understand whether we have dependent variables, how many there may be, and and really very importantly, the type of data that we're dealing with, so metric versus non-metric, and ultimately what our goal is. Is it we want to accomplish? Do we want to be able to compare groups of respondents? Do we want to be able to identify group membership by respondent, like target markets? Do we want to show relationships and make predictions, for instance? That's another thing that we want to do. Or do we want to be able to show like high-level structure of data where we have lots of different models all working together? Think about what the purpose is of your research, why you're doing your research, then think about the type of data that you have, and that will help lead you to the method that you will ultimately choose to do your research.